It's an uncomfortable truism of the human condition that sociopaths are made and not born, and the life and death of the Irish child rapist and serial killer Robert Howard must surely rank as a testament to that fact. However, what makes his story of violence and abuse so remarkable is the possibility that several of his depraved crimes took place while he was working as a spy or informer for the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the disgraced UK paramilitary police force in the northeast of Ireland during a crucial period in the Long War, or the so-called Irish-British Troubles of 1966 to 2005. Robert Howard was born in 1944, spending his earliest years in the rural community of Wolfhill, County Laois, a relatively isolated region in the southern Midlands of Ireland. One of the younger siblings of a large impoverished family, he had a troubled childhood from almost the very beginning, exasperated by his father's drinking and violence, culminating in a burglary at the age of 13. His punishment was a period of detention in St. Joseph's Industrial School in Clonmel in County Tipperary, a home for wayward children run by the Roman Catholic Church. At the time, it was one of the self-contained territories of the Catholic Church's state within a state across the island. In subsequent years, it became known that some of its staff had practiced physical and sexual abuse against its incarcerated pupils. The adult Howard later claimed that he had been repeatedly assaulted in the institution by one or more religious employees, be they priests or the ironically named Christian Brothers. Released from the school at the age of 16, the teenager was denied access to the family home and became a vagrant living in local barns and sheds, and perhaps the long-abandoned coal mines in the Wolfhill countryside. Older members of the community remember rumours that one day an elderly farmer had been caught engaged in a sexual act with the youth, resulting in some trouble. For a while Howard survived by begging, scavenging and thievery until he was dispatched by the authorities to a second Catholic school in Dangan in County Offaly, another place with a reputation for casual violence and rape against minors. Eventually Howard emigrated to Britain, quite possibly forced to leave Laois by his neighbours and members of the Garda Síochána, a not uncommon occurrence during the period. In 1965, at the age of 21, he was arrested by the British police and successfully prosecuted for the sexual assault of a young child in her home, the UK authorities sending him back to Ireland within months of his conviction. However, by 1969 he had returned to Britain, where he was arrested and sentenced again, this time to 6 years in jail for another attempted rape and battery. In 1973 he was deported to Ireland by the British, despite assaulting a female warder while in prison, ending up in the holiday resort of Youghal in County Cork. Within months he was arrested by the Gardaí and charged with raping and beating a woman in her dwelling, receiving a risible 10-year sentence before returning to the streets in 1981. Disturbingly, during this period, Howard seems to have associated himself with one or more paedophiles in the Irish Midlands and was briefly under Garda observation. In 1983, he married an emotionally damaged woman several years his junior, in a brutal, drunk-fueled relationship which lasted for 3 years. By 1988, he was serving a short prison sentence for non-violent criminal offences, moving upon his release in 1990 to Newry, County Down, to attend an alcohol treatment unit run by the Catholic Church. Shortly thereafter he travelled to the rural town of Castlederg in County Tyrone, having befriended a male member of a local Irish nationalist family. At the time, the border area, on the western edge of the British-occupied northeast of Ireland, was a fiercely contested region between the relatively successful West Tyrone Brigade, or the Provisional IRA, and the UK military and paramilitary forces, principally the RUC, the regular army and various allied terrorist factions from the British Unionist community. A war zone in all but name. Concerns about an outsider's presence in the Castlederg area were taken away by his friendship with the Tyrone family and his seemingly innocuous nature. The Laois man lived for a while in a rundown caravan park just outside the town, a location for families and individuals seeking emergency accommodation from the local government council. For the next 5 years, the previously impoverished Howard was apparently never short of money. Despite no regular income, garnering a small entourage of fellow drinkers and social misfits, he frequently patronised out of his own pocket. These included a number of young women and girls passing through the caravan park or staying with local families. When not sitting with his cronies in the pubs of west of Tyrone and Donegal, he was roaming the countryside at all hours of the day and night. A traveller who seemed to turn up in the most unexpected of places. If some were worried about his activities, most dismissed him as a harmless crank. However, despite the initial impressions he gave, Howard was an arch manipulator of human gullibility, and by 1991 he had successfully lured a troubled woman, many years his junior, from Dublin to his home in Tyrone, where he imprisoned her for 3 weeks, subjecting her to repeated sexual assaults. These only came to an end when members of her family arrived and forcibly removed her from his control. Incredibly, the crime went unreported until 1996, the individual having borne Howard's child in the meantime. In 1993, the increasingly brazen abuser kidnapped a 16-year-old runaway girl from County Westmeath, also in the Midlands of Ireland, who was living with his then girlfriend, a member of the Tyrone family, which had taken a shine to him. Once again he indulged his most depraved whims, this time in a small flat he rented inside Castlederg itself. After 3 days the girl escaped, fleeing to the local police in the bullets-guarded, heavily fortified RUC base in the town. The RUC officers, who subsequently interviewed her, showed little sympathy for her plight, repeatedly expressing disbelief at her claims, despite forensic evidence that she had been drugged, assaulted and strangled. Whether their disinterest was due to the involvement of nationalists or Catholics, especially from the south, in an alleged crime or something more sinister, the girl never knew. Despite his arrest in relation to the kidnapping in Castlederg and being a known risk of flight or witness intimidation, Howard was inexplicably granted bail. However, something changed in the period before the scheduled court hearing, and the initial charges of 5 rapes and acts of sodomy were dropped by the paramilitary police. Instead, the accused pleaded guilty to unlawful carnal knowledge of an underage girl, a far lesser charge. To outsiders, the implication seemed to be that the events in his home had been consensual, and the guilty admission was a technical one, arising out of the teenager's age. Free while awaiting sentencing, the seemingly untouchable Howard struck once again, kidnapping and disappearing 15-year-old Arlene Arkinson from Castlederg during a nighttime visit to a neighbouring county, Donegal. The vulnerable child, troubled by the loss of her mother at an early age, was never seen again, her body to this day undiscovered. This time the serial rapist's actions were to catch up with him, as Arlene was known to be one of the handful of girls Howard regularly associated with, and was last seen in his company. While local people organised high-profile searches in Donegal and Tyrone, the house of the family Howard's was friendly with, and who may have been at least partially complicit in his actions, was firebombed. Around the same time, several members of the local community approached senior officers of the West Tyrone Brigade of the IRA, urging them to investigate the matter. The killer quickly fled into hiding across the border, living rough for a short time, before being arrested by the RUC, in what some believe was a prearranged detention for his own safety. Despite widespread suspicions about his involvement in Arlene's disappearance, the UK authorities chose to pursue the previous case of kidnapping and assault against Howard, and he was sentenced to a notable lenient 3-year suspended sentence in 1995. Within months of his release, he was in the UK, seeking government-funded accommodation, claiming he was being pursued by the IRA. For a while he drifted around the UK, with occasional fleeting trips across the Irish Sea. His past never far behind him. By 2001, he had befriended and seduced a British woman in Kent, through her gaining access to 14-year-old Hannah Williams. Hannah had already been subjected to childhood abuse by an ex-boyfriend of her mother, and was in some ways typical of the victims the predator Howard sought out. Inevitably, the leash man kidnapped, raped and murdered the child, burying her body in scrubland near the Blue Lake at Northfleet, where it was discovered by construction crews building the extension line of the Channel Tunnel some 12 months later. In 2003, Howard was arrested and charged with the killing. When the British police in Kent sought background information on the suspect from their colleagues in the Police Service of Northern Ireland, the successor to the disbanded RUC. They were astonished to be met with a virtual wall of silence. Despite repeated efforts, cooperation took months to kick into gear, the murder detectives gaining greater help from the Garda Síochána. Howard was eventually convicted of the killing during a trial, which revealed much more of his dreadful criminal career, soon encompassing a litany of other offences and suspected offences. In 2005, a criminal court in Belfast found Howard not guilty of the murder and disappearance of Arlene Arkinson, when the jury was denied the knowledge of his previous convictions. Weeks later, a case of raping yet another young woman was also dismissed by the UK-administered courts in Belfast. In October of 2015, 71-year-old Robert Howard, the self-styled Wolf Hill werewolf, died in prison in Frankland, a jail for high-risk prisoners in County Durham, Britain. He was just weeks away from testifying at a new coroner's inquest into the disappearance of Arlene Arkinson. Family and friends hoping he might finally reveal the circumstances of her death and the whereabouts of her remains. Now, in 2016, on the eve of the long-delayed inquest, it has been announced that the British government is refusing to hand over a number of files from the PSNI and former RUC directly related to Robert Howard on the grounds of national security. The attempted cover-up by the UK authorities seems to add further weight to the long-held suspicions circulating since the mid to late 1990s that Howard had been recruited by the Tyrone RUC as a police informer sometime between 1990 and 1993, and was under their protection until he went too far in 1994 with the murder of Arlene Arkinson. Even then, rather than being brought to justice, the serial rapist was shuttled off to Britain, away from further investigations by concerned parties within the paramilitary police or the IRA. The decision of the United Kingdom to block a full and impartial investigation into the circumstances of Arlene Arkinson's disappearance and Robert Howard's involvement, of course, brings to mind similar attempts by Britain to impede any examination of the Kincora's Boys home scandal. It seems that the British dirty war in Ireland was a very dirty one indeed.